In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the Structured Query Language, or SQL, and specifically Transact SQL, which is Microsoft's extension to the SQL language. So as you see on the slide, Structured Query Language is commonly abbreviated with the letters SQL and pronounced SQL. SQL is a language that is used to interact with a relational database. So what does that mean? What kind of things can you do with it? Well, you can use SQL to select records from a table and return those results to an application or even directly to your screen. You can use SQL to insert data into your tables, and you can also update and delete data as needed, all using SQL. SQL also functions as a means to manage the objects in your relational database. Basically, SQL provides you the ability to create, manage, and maintain all aspects of your database. As a user or developer, you can write SQL statements that will be processed and executed by the relational database, such as SQL Server, in a variety of ways. You can write the SQL statements directly within SQL Server Management Studio, which we'll see in this video, or you can send them to SQL Server 2005 via your applications. SQL was originally developed in the 1970s at IBM. IBM needed a way to work with their relational database engine at the time. Eventually, the need for standardization of the SQL language became obvious, and both the ANSI Institute and the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, have released SQL standards. There have been many versions of SQL standards developed and improved over the years by both ANSI and ISO. Microsoft SQL Server 2005 is based on the SQL Server standard approved in 1992, commonly referred to as SQL 92. So you may have noticed that I said Microsoft's version of the SQL standard, which is their implementation of the SQL 92 standard called T-SQL. So Microsoft's version actually adds to the SQL 92 implementation approved in 1992 by providing some additional extensions to the language. T-SQL is SQL 92 compliant, although it does add some new twists to various SQL commands so that the SQL you write with Microsoft SQL Server 2005 may not be 100% backwards compatible with other relational database engines in all cases. However, it's best practice to write your SQL that is SQL 92 compliant whenever possible. So this next slide I wanted to really dive in and just show you conceptually what are some of the things you can do with SQL. Well, the first thing you can do is you can write queries, and as I said before, the queries are used to retrieve data from the database. So I've shown you an example here on this slide, and simply you can use a series of SQL commands or clauses that form the SQL statement that can then be interpreted by SQL Server. The database engine, in this case SQL Server 2005, will return those results of your queries as a result set. So an example of the query would be select star from a particular table. And we're going to get into all the different syntax and how to write queries and some of the other things I'm talking about in this series and others. So don't be concerned if you're not fully understanding everything, or at least from a syntax perspective. So the other thing you can do with T-SQL is to create database objects in your database. And this is known as the Data Definition Language, or DDL. So you can use the DDL to create the database itself, modify the database, create tables, and create views. The data definition language is very powerful and can be used in many different ways, not just the ones I mentioned here. We'll take a deeper dive into DDL in future videos. Lastly, what I wanted to point out was you can also use SQL to write data manipulation language queries, or DML. And data manipulation language queries are used to insert, update, or delete the data in your tables in your database. And there's a good example, delete from a particular table. Also, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here as we'll cover it in more slides, but you can use T-SQL for writing security objects and managing your security, database administration, management, and that's just to name a few. Again, it's a very powerful language which you can do many different things with. So now that I've walked through some of the concepts behind SQL and T-SQL, I wanted to open up SQL Server Management Studio and demonstrate a couple of these topics in action. So you can see that I've opened up SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to paste in some SQL statements that I wrote to show you some of the things I've been talking about in this video. Now this first example, this create table employee, now don't worry about the syntax, but this is an example of a data definition language statement. And if I run this, basically what I'm doing is I'm creating a table in my database, and I've created a table and I've defined some fields. So that's one example of a SQL statement where you can use that to define the objects in your database. Next is a quick example of a data manipulation language query, and this is an insert statement. So I'm going to insert some records into my database table that I just created, the employee table. You can actually also delete records from a table or update records that are already existing in a table, but it's just a quick example of some of the things you can do and kind of give you an idea of the different look and feel of the syntax. And next I have just a simple query, and it's just I'm going to select all the records from the employee table that I just created. So I can hit select. Now you can see that in my results pane below that all the records from that table were returned to me. And again, this is the table that I created and the one record that I inserted that was returned to me. And then lastly, I'm just going to drop the table from the database. So again, it's just an example of how you can use SQL to completely manage the creation of the objects in your database, inserting the records, updating your data, and then retrieving data from your database as well. So as I conclude this video, I wanted to mention that you'll be learning how to take full advantage of the SQL language and working with T-SQL through the remainder of this series. T-SQL 101 is an introduction into the T-SQL syntax, including data manipulation language, and will be followed by more advanced topics in the T-SQL 201 series. This concludes this video.
You're watching another great instructional video from Trainingspot.com, your IT training destination.